Shabbat Shalom. So, last Shabbat, an unfamiliar, unexpected person walked into a synagogue. And the rabbi had to make a snap decision whether there was more there to meet the eye, decided there wasn't, and rushed to greet this unusual visitor and extend hospitality. Now, by the way, that story played out at more than one congregation last week. It played out here at B'nai Torah, and even as I was going to greet the person, our Sandy Springs police officer on duty was sort of coming around in a flanking maneuver, knowing that I'm always engaging in these kinds of shenanigans. And it turned out that the visitor was just someone who one of our congregants had met at the library and invited to come to services. In Colleyville, Texas, things played out a little differently. Rabbi Charlie Citron Walker offered gracious hospitality to a person who he suspected might not have a home. And he and 3 members of his community ended up being held hostage for almost 12 hours by a gun-wielding extremist seeking the freedom of a convicted terrorist. And as FBI and other law enforcement waited outside, it was training that Rabbi Citron Walker had received that made the difference between life and death. There are some important differences. One is that we have security on site who were ready to jump in. But the biggest difference is something that is totally out of our control, is the luck of the draw. And each of us has our own responses to hearing that story. For some of us, this feels like our story because we are of the Jewish faith. For some of us, it is a story that is one step removed, even though we are not Jewish. People who are of the Jewish faith are very important to us. We read this morning in Exodus chapter 18 that Moses tells Yitro, his father-in-law, all that has befallen the Jewish people, everything that the Lord did to Pharaoh, to the Egyptians for Israel's sake, all the hardships that had befallen him on the way, and how the Lord had delivered them. And the text says that Yitro's response is vayichad, which is a word whose meaning is not clear. The most common translation is that he rejoiced. And certainly we, too, can celebrate a miraculous escape. However, in the Talmud, Sanhedrin 94a, the sage Samuel says that it means that his skin was filled with goosebumps. He had an involuntary reaction of alarm. Even though he did not directly experience slavery or plagues or the splitting of the sea, he experienced a sympathetic response. He felt as if he were there. And I think that is how many of us felt last Saturday during Shabbat, or if we heard after Shabbat, hearing that news. Because only a few congregations in this country know what it is to have an armed incident, an armed attack. But every rabbi in the country knows what it means to wonder whether a particular visitor is a potential threat. Many Jews have asked, is it safe to come to Shul? And the answer is, in some sense, yes. And we can talk at another time about all the detailed procedures we have in place. We had a meeting this week to discuss what we can learn from this incident. We're ordering new, more aerodynamic chairs. It's a shame that that's funny. Or maybe it's not. But what we do know is that security comes with sacrifice. We invest huge amounts of money. Imagine how many more staff we could hire with the money that we spend to ensure that we have security here when we need it. Imagine how much more welcoming we could be if our doors were simply open. The answer in a deeper sense is that coming to synagogue now is safer than it has been in most places and most times in Jewish history. European synagogues older than a certain age were all built like fortresses to keep out the marauders. Now, if you go to Europe and you are lost trying to find the synagogue, just look for the building that has the guys with machine guns standing out front. And be prepared to let them know that you are coming in advance, show your passport, and maybe even sing a few verses of Adon Olam to confirm that you are who you say you are. I wrote more about this in my blog post this week. I want to take us in a different direction this morning here in synagogue, what should be a time of peace, a time of study, a time of spirituality. I want to talk to you about three complexities of this story and close with what I think is the most important takeaway, and each with a little bit of Torah added for good measure. The first takeaway is the complexity of anti-Semitism. Now, there's a lot we still don't know about the terrorist. We don't know his level of sanity. As of the last time that I checked, we did not know whether he took his own life or he was killed by law enforcement. We know that he was motivated to free a terrorist being held in a Texas prison for trying to kill American soldiers. The FBI, when it first reported on the attack, said that the motivation was not anti-Semitism. That is ridiculous. The attacker did not pick a target at random. He did not walk into Kentucky Fried Chicken and ask to be connected to Colonel Sanders. He did not walk into a Bob's Big Boy and demand to speak with Bob Schoenbaum. He walked into a synagogue and asked to be connected with the chief rabbi of the United States. We now have one, apparently, appointed by this guy. But here's the thing. For many people in the world, including many who have never met a Jew, we are not just who we are actors in their story. And that's true whether you are coming with anti-Semitism from the right or the left. The Jews control the media. The Jews control the weather. And so there are many people for whom we are an external force. We are a player in their story. So whether it is those who hope that our return to Israel will bring about the second coming, or those who imagine that Jews make the dust doctors and accountants, whatever it might be, we are players in their tale. And unfortunately, anti-Semitism has become a political wedge. I'm going to ask Nat, can we close the door? Anti-Semitism has become a political wedge. So Deborah Lipstadt, in our own Atlanta community, has been nominated as an envoy in anti-Semitism, and it is being held up by partisan games. Our country, we know that it is an issue. And by the way, we also know that many kinds of racism that are unacceptable are somehow given a pass when they are directed against Jews. But this is not new. In the 10 Commandments that we read this morning, we read the 7th commandment is, "Thou shalt not steal." Now, by the way, stealing is forbidden in more than one place in the Bible. And so a number of the commentators say that the 7th commandment, "Thou shalt not steal," is a very specific variation, which is the commandment not to steal people, not to engage in kidnapping, in hostage taking. And yet, one of the most basic commandments, a commandment that is higher than anything else. So there's a whole ranking of how you can reallocate money. And so, for example, if you raised money to build a synagogue, you are allowed to divert it to buy a Torah scroll. If you raised money to buy a Torah scroll, you can't use it to go and build the synagogue instead. But money for almost anything can be diverted for pidyon shvuyim, to rescue captives. Because if you look at Jewish history, all of Jewish history, Jews were taken captive by people who had the motives of using us as a lever to get what they want, whether it was money or political aims or whatever it might be. This is not news. And so it is anti-Semitic if you attack Jews, even though your motives might be elsewhere. That's the first complexity, simplified. The second complexity is the complexity of relationships between Muslims and Jews. It so happens that Rabbi Konigsberg and our Social Action Committee are spearheading an effort to resettle an Afghan Muslim family. And I spent some time on Thursday trying to figure out how we could secure a lease for this family that we are helping. And I got, let's call it some side eye from some folks about why we as a synagogue would be helping a Muslim family. On the same day, my Shabbat Shalom article, I noted that the attacker of the synagogue was a Muslim, and I was called out for Islamophobia for mentioning the faith of the attacker. And the answer is, it's complicated. If you blame all Muslims for the actions of some, then that is the definition of racism, blaming an entire group for how you feel about one of them. On the other hand, if you fail to recognize the source of a person's hate, whether it be Muslim anti-Semitism, whether it be white supremacy, whatever it might be, the alt-right, the alt-left, it doesn't matter. If you don't recognize, if you are not honest about who hates you, that is the definition of naivete. And the terrorist who he was trying to flee blamed Jews for her sentence. And at her trial, she had one demand. She wanted no Jews on her jury, and she wanted the jury to be genetically tested to confirm that. So there's an organization called CARE, which is an Islamic advocacy group, and they came out with an expression of support and sympathy. And yet a month earlier, the director of CARE in San Francisco, a lawyer named Zara Bilu, told the annual conference of American Muslims for Palestine that even polite Zionists were not to be trusted. Even the ADL, Jewish Federation, Hillel, and Zionist synagogues. And our portion gives us some guidance to think about this challenge. So Yitro this week comes to visit Moses, and he is incredibly supportive, encouraging. Choten Moshe, he is the most important advisor that Moses has. And he is treasured, appearing more than once in our Torah. And he is a Midianite. And yet in Numbers we are told that the Midianites are a mokesh, smite them. And so the answer is you can't judge one Midianite on the basis of the action of another. Complexity simplified. There is a battle for the soul of Islam in which we are bystanders and, at worst, collateral damage. You have Arab and Islamic nations like the UAE who are delighted to have friendship and collaboration with Israel and with Jews, and you have groups that have sworn our destruction. And if we conflate one with the other, then we are just as foolish as if we put all of them in the same bucket the other way. The third complexity is the complexity of our own community. I don't know Rabbi Citron Walker. There are members of our community who do, who studied with him, who are friends with him. And there have been some wonderful letters and statements of support from organizations across the country, around the world. And yet, the Israeli chief rabbinate has been strangely silent. The Shabbat ends a lot earlier in Israel, and in fact, from some corners of the Jewish world, there have been voices saying, well, they had it coming to them. Sometimes we are our own worst enemies. The Jewish Dairy Forward, which is one of the national news outlets in the Jewish community posted an article that Rabbi Citron Walker had already announced that he was leaving his congregation and sought to air dirty laundry about disputes. The board didn't like how he was running the Hebrew school. He wasn't right-wing enough on Israel. Whatever it was, that was not the time. And I want to point out that we have strange expectations of our rabbis. Now, by the way, I like my job. I just signed up for another 4 years. And I will tell you that we are in the search for another rabbi to join Rabbi Konigsberg and I, who we hope will really add to the strength of our community. Our best candidate is coming to visit February 11th. But I will tell you that this search has been very unlike our previous several. The last time we searched for a new rabbi for our community, we were blessed to have an overflow of candidates. America is actually facing, believe it or not, a shortage of non-Orthodox rabbis. We are going to be very lucky if we can get a rabbi of the caliber of the rabbi who we have come visiting in a few weeks. Because rabbis know that we are putting our lives and our families on the line to do what we do. And we are asked to do a lot of things: to preach, to care for those who are in need, to be fundraisers, to be educators, and now to be able to throw a chair like a WWF wrestler as well. And so the complexity of our community is, how do we relate to each other? How do we relate to leadership? How do we give each other grace? And it goes in both directions. Leaders to congregations, congregations to leaders. How do we recognize that, in fact, the competition is the people out there, not the people in here? Those are the complexities, but I want to close with a takeaway. I want to close with, because those are all big picture things where no matter what we do, we're not going to make that much difference as individuals or even as a community. The most important takeaway from this story is the power of being a Mensch, the difference that one person can make. We can have all kinds of debates about what makes us safer. Because, by the way, I talked before about whether we feel safe in synagogue. I don't know. We are at risk in schools, in supermarkets, in nightclubs, in concerts, in places of work. Wherever you go now, there is a danger. You look over your shoulder. And as one of my colleagues said, you can debate the power of a good guy with a gun, but sometimes a mensch with a chair is just as powerful. You know, people have said, should Rabbi Citron Walker have greeted that visitor as he did? Should he have let the enemy in the door? And our Jewish values say yes. Our Jewish values say that synagogues have to be a place that welcome those who are in need, welcome those who are in distress. Sometimes we have the strength to defeat evil on the battlefield. Sometimes we have the weapons to protect ourselves from evil, or we have others who carry those weapons for us. Other times our faith is our armor. If we have the choice whether to be strong or to be weak, which is not a choice that Jews had for most of our history, if we have the choice whether to be strong or weak, let's be strong. But if we have the power to be cruel or to be kind, let's be kind. Because it takes courage to be Jewish. It takes courage to be anyone today. And that's the message for each of us, that somehow we each have the power to be a mensch in the face of evil. And I hope, I pray, that none of us here are ever facing down the barrel of a gun. We have 2 Sandy Springs police officers standing outside who have had that experience in their line of work, and they are prepared to do that for us right now, if needed. And I'm grateful to them. In Texas, the FBI and everyone else was very supportive, standing around outside waiting for something to happen. The hostages were not freed, they escaped. But if we have the choice whether to be strong or weak, let's be strong. But if we have the power to be cruel or kind, let's be kind. That we know that we have survived for thousands of years, not because of our might, but because of our right. On Hanukkah, there is a Haftorah that we read, and it is actually one of the only Haftorahs that we read twice in the year. We read it on Hanukkah, and then we read it again in the summer Parshat Baalotcha, the words of the prophet Zechariah. Not by might, lo b'chayil, not by power, lo b'koach, ki im beruchi. And those words of Zechariah, I think, have to speak to us, that we can seek might and power, and if we can get them, we should. But that ultimately is acting with the Spirit of God that makes us worth saving. Shabbat Shalom and Shabbat Shalom.